Sue Ann Ward. I'm priest here at Grace Anglican Church in Waterdown. Welcome on this Pentecost Sunday, and thank you to our Altar Guild for the beautiful balloons. Today we continue our preaching series on the Canon of Scripture, the book selected by the Church to be included in the official library of books that we often bind together and call the Bible. In previous weeks, we have engaged in a general overview of the canon. We've explored the Torah, we've met the prophets, and we've examined the books of wisdom literature. All of these previous messages can be found on the GraceAnglicanWaterdown.org website and on the Grace Church YouTube channel. This week, we turn our attention to the historical books of the Hebrew Scriptures. These books offer us narratives about the tribal and the spiritual stories of the Israelite people over several centuries of history. We begin with the book of Joshua. In it, the Israelites, the descendants of Abraham, who had escaped from slavery in Egypt under the leadership of Moses, entered into a covenant with God at Mount Sinai. They survive many years in the wilderness, go into the promised land, battle the Canaanites, conquer the land, and settle there in each of 12 tribes. Joshua begins leading as the new Moses, and the book details many fierce and deadly battles. The Israelites are largely successful, and they believe that God has delivered them from their opponents. It is in this book that we hear the story of the walls of Jericho coming tumbling down. Some of you may recall a children's song about that. This book reminds us that the Israelites are expected to trust in and obey God fully. Next, in the book of Judges, we learn that before there were kings, the tribes were ruled by judges. These were not like courtroom officiants. They were tribal chieftains. The book highlights the moral corruption and failings of the Israelite people, and we read many disturbing, violent, and tragic stories. The books of Joshua and Judges should just have warning labels across them. If you are picking up the Bible for the first time, my advice is, don't start here. These, likely greatly exaggerated war stories, were written by the Israelites from their perspective for their purposes, and they contain a lot of murder and mayhem. Ultimately, this book highlights the need for the Israelites to follow the commands of God found in the Torah, and it ends by suggesting that the Israelites have a need for one king to rule over all of the 12 tribes. The books called 1st and 2nd Samuel were originally one book that was broken into parts because it was just too long to fit on one scroll. These books offer us three main characters: the prophet Samuel, who narrates the story, Saul, who becomes the first king, and David, who follows Saul as king. In the story, we are told that a woman named Hannah, thought to be barren, had a child, Samuel, who becomes a prophet. Samuel is told that God will raise up a king, a Messiah for the people of Israel. The first king, Saul, though gifted with great promise, is not the Messiah, and is in fact not a good king. The next king, David, who you may know from the renowned David and Goliath story, is at first positively contrasted with the proud characters of King Saul and Goliath the Philistine. But in the end, after all of the hope that David was the king that Israel was waiting for as the Messiah, he too fell short of his promise. But we are told that despite David's failings, God will honor the covenant, and the Messiah will come through David's line. The books of 1st and 2nd Kings were also originally one book that was split into two due to scroll length. These books tell the tales of the kings who led Israel after David. The stories demonstrate those kings' shortcomings and at times abject failures. They begin with King Solomon, a very wise king, who built the first temple in Jerusalem. And I have a test for you this morning. Where was Solomon's temple located? On the side of his head, of course. The fortunes of the Israelite people were as bad as my jokes. And we read in the books of Kings about the splitting of Israel into two kingdoms, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. This eventually led to the demise of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, and the Israelites being taken into exile in Babylon. It is in the books of Samuel and Kings that we are introduced to some of Israel's prophets, those whose role was to communicate to the people on behalf of God. In the Jewish Tanakh, these books are actually referred to as the former prophets, rather than as historical books. The remaining historical books include Ruth, Esther, Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Ruth is a beautiful book. It describes loyalty and obedience to the laws of Moses. There are three main characters, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. Naomi and Ruth, Naomi's daughter-in-law, become widows. Ruth returns to Israel with Naomi to live with her and to care for her, even though Ruth is not an Israelite. Boaz, a wealthy landowner and relative of Naomi, is so impressed with Ruth's loyalty to Naomi that he marries Ruth and cares for both women. What kind of man was Boaz before he married, I hear you asking? He was ruthless. I know, I need a little laugh track in the background here. Anyway, in this story, Ruth demonstrates loyalty to Naomi, and Boaz demonstrates obedience to the law of Moses. All three characters are positive examples of what it looks like to live as God's people. Ezra and Nehemiah appear as separate works, but they were actually originally one book. The books were named for two Israelite leaders. These books begin in the time after some of the Israelites returned to Jerusalem following the Babylonian exile. The Babylonian exile is a major time marker in the Hebrew scriptures, and historical events are often described as pre-exilic, exilic, or post-exilic. These books describe post-exilic events. It is during this time that the temple is rebuilt, the community is rebuilt, and the city is surrounded by new walls. The book relates many ups and downs in the experiences of the Israelites, and we learn that the political and social reforms instituted by Ezra and Nehemiah don't address the core issues that the people are experiencing after their return from exile. What they really need is to change their hearts and embrace the love of God. The book of Esther is unique in our scriptures in that it does not mention God even once. The book speaks of Israelites who are living in the Persian Empire, specifically two people, Mordecai and his niece, Esther. It is a long story, but in the end, Mordecai and Esther save the Jewish people from Haman, an advisor to the Persian king. Mordecai and Esther become heroes who initiate a Jewish festival called Purim. The books of Chronicles summarize all of the Jewish scriptures, beginning with Adam and ending after the return from the Babylonian exile. It provides a detailed genealogy that leads us through the line of David toward the Messianic king as well as the priestly line. The main point is that the Messianic king will be the best of King David. The book ends with the hope for the future that points toward the Messiah, a new temple, and a new kingdom. The historical books make clear at least two things. First, no matter what, God never abandons the people of God. And second, God works with people to nurture the kingdom of God on earth. Next week, we continue our journey through the canon of Scripture with a presentation of the Deuterocanonical Books, sometimes referred to as the Apocrypha. These are books that are included in the Bibles of many Christian denominations, but not all. They are very interesting, and they help to provide a bridge from the Hebrew Scriptures to the New Testament. Until next week, I send you love and God's blessings. I will conclude on this Pentecost Sunday with a tribute from some members of the music ministry here at Grace.